for it right now. And I would encourage everyone just to perhaps go on to speaker view so you can see Mark. And again, please, everyone, if you're not muted, please mute yourselves. So
thanks so much, Rabbi. I appreciate it. I just want everyone to know I've had the honor of being personal friends with your Rabbi for many years, and he knows me as Moshe, which is my camp name. And I appreciate your professionalism, especially tonight. I'm going to share the screen and we will get started. Okay. The murder of George Floyd by Minneapolis police has sparked a national reckoning on race, with a level of public interest we have not seen since the 1960s. When we look at the protests that followed, their size, their number of white allies, the cities and towns across the country that hosted them, we can argue that what's going on now is even bigger than the 60s. This could be the most significant moment in American racial justice since Reconstruction ended in 1877. And I'll just say, I wrote that line before last week's insurrection, and I think we're hearing even more now about Reconstruction as a moment for comparison. Let's look at the current situation. Our very definition of the word racism is changing. When I grew up, and I'll just say that I grew up at Temple Bethel in San Pedro, where the rabbi was before he came to you, there I learned that racism meant you supported the KKK or you supported Jim Crow. Now we have a different definition. Now racism is when you're not being anti-racist. It used to mean treating someone else differently because of the color of their skin. And now it means enjoying the benefits from a social system that privileges whites at the expense of people of color. White liberalism, in my research, white Jewish liberalism in specific, has been turned upside down. And thank you for bringing out Quest for Inclusion. That was my first book where I did this exploration. White Jewish support for civil rights honored the American Jewish community as white America's most activist liberal advocates for racial equality. Now, though, white liberals and white Jewish liberals are being seen as part of the problem instead of the answer. So this came home for me literally when the publisher of my book, Black Power, Jewish Politics, which we'll be speaking about Erev Shabbat, reversed a decision it made to publish a new preface in the book. And I'll be talking more about this on Friday night, but just to give you a bit of a lead in, an anonymous scholar didn't like that I used the words white supremacy to describe a system of privilege that American Jews participate in and benefit from. The publisher also didn't like that I paid attention to Jews of color. And specifically, I argued that we as history professors had not done enough to tell the stories of Jews of color. So as a result, it made the front page of the foreword. It's been about 2 weeks now, and it's inspiring a national conversation on many of the subjects that we're talking about today. So what we're going to do this evening is take a deep dive into this often uncomfortable topic of American Jews, race, and racism. I'm going to try to bridge the gap between the rhetoric you may be reading or watching on TV with our own understandings of the American Jewish experience. Today is more about, well, it's less about history actually, it's more about historical memory. What we remember about our past is oftentimes a bigger deal than what actually happened. Academic historians are often tasked with the challenging job of piercing our history bubbles. When we go to the archives to research a new book, we often find a very different story than the ones we ourselves learned when we were growing up. So today's lecture is probably going to tell a very different story than the ones that you may know about Jews and race. I'll offer empathy. The same was true for me when I began the work. So I'm going to assume that all of you have already heard and know the story of American Jewish success, of our social mobility, of achieving the American dream. And the good news is all of that is true. America has offered us an extraordinary if exceptional experience. American Jews did work hard. Our parents and grandparents pressed their children to get an education. They sacrificed for a better future. They achieved extraordinary success in business, in law, in medicine, you name it, right? Jews did, as the saying goes, pull ourselves up by our bootstraps to achieve the American dream. And Jews also achieved success, especially in the years after World War II, because of our privileged racial status. And even before World War II, racism created a system of white supremacy, where those considered white enjoyed like VIP status in America. They were supreme, at least when compared to people of color. They enjoyed better and easier access to education, to healthcare, to judicial system, to housing, right? You name it, as we're learning more and more these months. In such a powerful irony, Jews who ourselves suffer from anti-Semitism also benefit from white supremacy. This is a both and situation. So today's class is going to focus on race and racism, white privilege, white supremacy, it's going to have a single specific goal: trace the relationship between American Jews, race and racism from our first arrival on American shores in 1654 all the way up till today. We could even say literally this week. We will be investigating 3 different expressions of racism in American Jewish history. First, we're going to look at times when American Jews actually embraced racist thoughts. Fortunately, of the 3 categories, this one is the smallest. But we're also going to look at times when American Jews were complicit in racism. This is when Jews remained silent to the racism around them. It happened more often in history. It's still, of course, a challenge today. But perhaps most importantly and most different for us educated in a different era, we're going to look at times when American Jews benefit from racism, whether they were trying to or not, whether they even knew they were or not, because I think this is where our current debate is centered. Systemic racism, white supremacy, operate in a way that privileges most American Jews without them even having to try. All we have to do here is simply exist, and we are already a part of a system of racial separation when it comes to how our society is going to allocate its resources. So this is the focus for us today. We're going to talk about white Jews. Now, we're not going to debate what whiteness is. If you're interested, that's another talk that I give. I'm just going to say that if you look like me, right, then we're going to define ourselves as white, and that will be the focus. And that's because it's really important at the outset to say that the experience of Black Jews and other Jews of color are very different from those of white Jews. For the most part, their stories have not been documented. And when I wrote that new preface in the book, my editors objected. And in fact, they objected to the point that they ultimately didn't run the new preface as a consequence. While this isn't the focus of today's talk, it's still something we need to know and learn. The histories of Jews of color is largely absent. And fortunately now, I think as part of our reckoning on race, there's a whole lot of new work that's getting started. I encourage you to read up on these experiences and stories. There's lots on the internet. Feel free to send me an email, or you can even go to my website and there's a contact link there, and I can send you some of my favorites. So it is great to be here. First of all, all of us in California are very happy for the state of Commonwealth of Pennsylvania generally. My very first academic year, I was at Bryn Mawr. So I did spend a year on the main line and got to know a little bit about at least the greater Philadelphia area. For those of you taking notes, I offer an historical question for all of my students when I'm teaching at SF State. Today, the focus is on the question, how and why have white American Jews supported, complied, and benefit from systemic racism? And here is my argument tonight. The process of becoming American over time and place encouraged Jews to embrace the political and social culture around them. Regardless of time or place, that meant Jews benefit from a system of white supremacy that rewarded them with privileges that were not extended to people of color. While it is an important and heartwarming story, Jews' disproportionate participation in social justice causes did not negate the influence of their whiteness in their impressive rise. Systemic racism doesn't demand agreement. It simply exists. So my career thesis argues that Jews tend to follow the political culture of the society around them, no matter where they are. Today, I'm just going to take that thesis and I'm going to apply it to the question of Jews and race. And I'm using this idea of becoming American as our way to understand what's going on, because over both time and place, Jews have worked to become American. I mean, in our own families, we know they learned English, right? They changed their religious practice. Oftentimes they changed their names. But one of the things that our ancestors did to become American was racism. And as today's thesis argues, becoming American sometimes meant that Jews embraced outright racism. Other times it meant that they took actions or didn't take actions when racism was happening around them, the complicity. And they benefit from racism whether they were trying to or not. So as the rabbi mentioned, here's how it's going to go tonight. So actually a congregation down in Orange County, California reached out, and this is what the rabbi was referencing. They said they wanted a lecture on Jews and racism. And in all my years, I never actually even thought of a lecture like this because it's so challenging and difficult to digest. I didn't know that there would be interest. Just, you know, the good news here, not only is there interest, this is actually the most requested Zoom lecture that I give. So what I decided to do is just take the book that Rabbi Zola and I edited. I just started on page 1. And I started looking for historical documents related to race. And I just photocopied them. I highlighted them. I made this PowerPoint demonstration. So what we're going to do tonight is just walk through actual historical documents related to race. And part of this is to say, none of this is new. This is a standard textbook now in university classes in American Jewish history. So students for the last 5 or 6 years since this book came out have been reading these documents as part of their curriculum. I guess what's different tonight is we're only pulling out the race-themed ones, and I'm giving you this becoming American argument to try to tie them together. But I think it's also important to know that as new as the perspectives are, the topic itself is not so new. So we're going to begin with this slide. This is a picture of Recife, Brazil. And Recife, Brazil was the town that the very first American Jews came from in 1654. And by looking at these very first group of American Jews, we can ask the question, what did it mean to become American in the 17th and the 18th centuries during the colonial period? How would Jewish immigrants act in their new surroundings? When and where would racism intersect with Judaism? So just for background, the Jewish population in the colonial period was really small. Somewhere between 2,500 and 5,000 Jews, most of whom were Sephardic, and they lived in port towns like Charleston and Newport and Savannah, in addition, of course, to New York and Boston and Philadelphia near you. They largely made their living in trade and commerce. And they did that because they were fellow Jews across the Atlantic, fellow Jews across into the Caribbean. And if you were Christian and you had business and you needed to ship something across the ocean, you trusted Jewish merchants, because since it was like sometimes literally their family members on the other side of the ocean, they pretty much understood that you weren't going to rip them off. So in 1713, the colonial governor of New York issued an embargo of all goods from the British colony in North America to Jamaica. All right. Well, what are you going to do if you are a Jewish merchant and your job is to ship goods to Jamaica? Well, here is what you do. This is a document from 1713, and it's a letter from two Jewish merchants, De Lucina and Bosch, to Governor Robert Hunter. And I didn't highlight anything here. It's a petition. It's basically asking for permission to break the blockade so that they can make a living. Well, that's the easy document. What if the cargo wasn't dry goods going to Jamaica? What if the cargo was Africans coming back to North America in slavery? What's the Jewish thing to do then? What's the American thing to do? What's the right thing to do? Well, what would we do? Well, we'd like to think, right, that we would be anti-slavery and we would refuse to engage in the slave trade. But not if you lived in the 1700s, right? Slavery was the law of the land. The economy in the colonial period was built on slavery. Do you remember from school the triangle trade route, right? I learned that. I'm told now that actually they don't teach that anymore. But you can't have the triangle trade route if you don't have slavery. In fact, the entire shipping industry of colonial America relied on the transport of Africans into slavery. So what would colonial Jews do? They would do their job. And here we have our next document from 1762. This is a letter from two Jewish merchants to the captain of their ship. And here is the instruction that they give to their captain. I'm going to read it to you. And if your screen is big enough that you can see the highlighted, you can read along. The captain is instructed that you embrace the first fair wind and proceed to sea and make the best of your way to the windward part of the coast of Africa. And at your arrival there, dispose of your cargo for the most possible can be gotten, and invest the neat proceeds into as many good, merchantable, young slaves as you can, and make all the dispatch you possibly can. Okay, how do we analyze this historical document? Professor Eli Faber wrote an entire book on Jews in the slave trade, which is really important. You may be familiar with Louis Farrakhan and the Nation of Islam, and they have notoriously argued that Jews controlled the slave trade, that Jews were disproportionately involved in the slave trade. This is not true. And in fact, what the Nation of Islam and Farrakhan argued is pure anti-Semitism. And it's also true that there were Jews who were trading in slaves. Because they were part of the South, right? And that's what you did. So colonial Jews' own economy, own income was actually dependent on slavery. Slavery was woven into the fabric of society, and once that happened, it was woven into the fabric of American Jewish life. Now, I gave a little trick to you. If you're reading the document closely, you'll see this ship actually didn't even set sail from the South. This ship sailed from Newport, Rhode Island, which means the boundaries and borders of slavery didn't actually know the Mason-Dixon line. Well, let's push it to an even more challenging question. What did it mean to be an American if you were actually in the South? What if you earned a comfortable living? Would you own slaves yourself? And you know where this is going? Yeah, they would, right? But how would you self-reflect on your slave ownership? How could you possibly reconcile that with Judaism? If you had to choose between enjoying your status as a white Southerner who could own slaves and your obligations as a Jew who we hoped would mean you would be opposed to slavery, what would it look like? So with this, I want to offer a warning, and that is that the next document I show is going to have the N-word. Of course, I am not going to say it, but you will see it in front of you. Here is a letter from Mayor Josephson, a Jewish man in the South, to Michael Gratz, who it turns out was actually his cousin. And it's from 1762. And here is a portion of that letter. If you come here for the coming Sabbath Nachmu, it would please me very much, because we are presently very lonesome on the Sabbath. I also inform you that I may again sell my N-word wench at a profit. So if a ship with N-words should arrive, or a ship with indentured Germans, you will let me know, because I cannot manage without a servant. The wench I now have has two virtues, both bad ones. First, she's drunk all day when she can get it. And second, she's mean, so that my wife cannot say a word to her. She's afraid of her. How did all this happen? A free N-word here wants to court her and to buy her from me. I don't want to give her away for less than 110 pounds with her bastard, because I bought the bastard too. Signed, your affectionate friend, the humble Meir, son of Joseph. All right, in terms of analyzing this one, wow. Okay, this was a typical letter, at least from Meir Josephson's perspective. Like, he had no idea this thing was gonna, hundreds of years later be used in a class. And I was most interested in how it integrated his Jewishness. He gives us the name of the Parsha in Hebrew. He talks about how lonely it is to be Jewish in the South on Shabbat, and how he would like companionship. And the closing salutation, your affectionate friend, the humble Meir, son of Yosef from Yever, scholar of blessed memory. This letter is as Jewish as it is racist. And it reflects for us that for Meir Josephson, at least, he had symmetry between his Jewish identity, between his American identity, and what it meant for him to be an American Jew. So now we'll move to the early national period. The Declaration of Independence, of course, 1776, it promised life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness to all, even though, of course, we know that was not granted and still isn't, but at least for Jews, it was an important promise. And the Constitution, about a dozen years later, promised the realization of the Declaration of Independence into law. Separation of church and state was really important for American Jews, except whether it was the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution or the way they'd been applied afterwards, it really only worked if you were white, literate, landed, and male. And guess what? There were Jewish men in the early republic who were just all of those things. And the moment that happened to those Jewish men, they were now complicit in a racist system without even trying. Here is from 1809, the last will and testament of Samuel Jones. And I'll read you a piece of the will. After my funeral expenses and my lawful debts are paid, if I should not emancipate my Negro woman Jenny and her son Emmanuel during my lifetime, it is my desire that my executors do emancipate my Negro woman Jenny and her son Emmanuel, and give to Jenny my bed sheets, bedstead, blankets, tables, pots, plates, chairs, looking glass. To my Negro woman Jenny, $200. To Jenny, I leave the income of the leases of $100 per year to be paid to her quarterly. And it is my further desire not to drive Jenny and her children out of the house in King Street until they have time to procure a place for their abode. So now let's analyze this document. We learn here that Jenny is getting more money than any other person and any organization. If you were to read the rest of it, you would see that she was treated the best. Jenny's son Emmanuel is getting money as well. Interestingly, Jenny is getting his bed sheets. Why bed sheets? Scholars have concluded that Samuel Jones is Emmanuel's father. And since Jenny cannot consent to sexual relations, this was rape. Today, we know it's wrong for men in the workplace to have sexual relationships with subordinates. If there's any power differential at all, there's a problem. This was slavery. Jenny wasn't a citizen. She wasn't a person according to the law. This cannot be romantic love. If it was love, then Samuel would have freed her, but he didn't. If it was love, then Samuel would have moved out of the South to the North, maybe homesteaded in the Midwest, Caribbean, Europe, anywhere, but he didn't. While we think being Jewish makes us different, I argue that in America, we tend to be more the same than we like to think. Becoming American encourages us to copy those around us. And I ask a painful and piercing question. What's wrong with raping an African-American woman you own in slavery? The question is ridiculous, but it's not, because Thomas Jefferson himself fathered multiple children with Sally Hemings, and she could not consent. And he was the one who wrote the Declaration of Independence. So if it turns out that our founding fathers, our nation's quintessential Americans, owned slaves, who could expect American Jews to call them out and act any differently? The Civil War. Slavery is wrong and it's un-Jewish. Judaism, especially for those of us in the Reform movement, believes in tikkun olam, repairing the world. Our rabbis take strong social justice positions, sometimes so strong that members of their own congregations dissent against them. And you can probably guess where this is going. This is Rabbi Morris Rafal, The Bible View of Slavery, a discourse from 1861. Now doing a devar, a sermon on Genesis 9:25. I'll read a piece of it to you. You and I may regret that in his anger, Noah should from beneath the waters of wrath again have fished up the idea and practice of slavery. But that he did so, it's a fact, which rests on the authority of Scripture. I arrive at the conclusion that next to the domestic relations between husband and wife, parents and children, the oldest relation of society with which we are acquainted is that of master and slave. When you remember that Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Job, the men with whom the Almighty conversed, all these men were slaveholders. Does it not strike you that you're guilty of something very little short of blasphemy? My friends, I'm sorry to find that I'm delivering a pro-slavery discourse. I'm no friend to slavery in the abstract, but still less friendly to the practical working of slavery. But I stand here as a teacher in Israel, not to place before you my own feelings and opinions, but to propound to you the word of God, the Bible view of slavery. The result of which the Bible view of slavery leads us is first, that slavery has existed since the earliest time. Second, that slavery is no sin, and that slave property is expressly placed under the protection of the Ten Commandments. Third, that the slave is a person and has rights not conflicting with the lawful exercise of the rights of his owner. Okay, so if you're reading closely at the top of the document, you might get the surprise, rest of the story of this. Rabbi Rafal is a Northern rabbi. In fact, he comes from New York City's B'nai Jeshurun congregation. And for those of you who are into American synagogues, outside of Bucks County, Jewish life, everyone goes to B'nai Jeshurun on the Upper West Side to see, how innovative synagogue life is done. So to imagine that even B'nai Jeshurun in the North is giving a Bible view of slavery tells us once again that the lines and divisions we have are actually a whole lot blurrier than we thought. So, one moment. Okay, yeah, here we go. Now let's move to Richmond. Hold on a second. Here we go. Okay, this is what I wanted to show you. On to Richmond. 1867. Rabbi Isaac Mayer Weiss was probably the most influential rabbi of his generation. He lived in Cincinnati. He was very involved with the founding of the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion. He ran his own newspaper in Cincinnati. And when the Civil War ended in 1865, he traveled to Richmond, Virginia to take a look. And he wrote a personal, diary of the trip. And when he got back to Cincinnati, he wrote it up and published it in this article. So here are Rabbi Wise's reflections on the American South at the end of the Civil War. As inevitable as fate, the 11 Southern states are to belong to the Negroes. The enfranchisement of the Negro and the disenfranchisement of so many white men places the destiny of those states entirely in the hands of the Negro. The next consequence will be that as many white men as will possibly be able to sell out will go to the North. This again is as inevitable as fate. For the Southern man will not submit to Negro rule 1 minute longer than he must. The longevity and prolification of the Negro in that climate gives him a natural advantage over the white race and must in time press it from these states. The next consequence of the emigration of the white will be a new immigration of Negroes from Africa. 11 Negro legislatures, the representatives of 11 states in Congress, the thinly populated country, the want of labor, the better climate than the African, the good government, the rich country. Take all these circumstances together, and you cannot deny that the Southern states in the course of 25 years will be a new Africa. The South will never be what it was. Her cotton trade is ruined. The white people will leave as fast as they can. That is the end of it, unquote. We are all linked to the culture around us. Becoming American extends even to our highest standing clergy. For Rabbi Wise, freedom for former slaves conflicted with his own view of what America should be and the America he wanted. And now we'll move to the Industrial Revolution in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Even though Reconstruction ended in 1877, systemic racism continued, just in different forms. Sharecropping replaced slavery. Lynchings maintained the terror of slave times. Poverty crimes invalidated the 13th Amendment and became what we now know as mass incarceration. While we typically think of this as Southern and not Northern, as non-Jewish rather than Jewish, the institutionalization of racism knew no such boundaries. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory in New York City, best known or sadly worst known, as I'm sure most of you would remember learning, was the site of a horrific fire in 1911 that killed 146 people, mostly Jewish women laborers. And we typically learn about the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire as a labor story, that there were unsafe working conditions that led to the fire. A lack of exits led to the deaths, that it was all built on a capitalist system that preyed on new immigrants who needed the work, that Jews were leaders of the union movement that helped after the fire. All good, right? Well, not so much. We know this was a class problem because it was about rich factory owners and poor immigrant workers. We knew it was a gender problem because Jewish women faced the worst of these working conditions. But we don't learn growing up in Hebrew school, this was also a systemic race problem as well. Because Triangle Shirtwaist Factory and all the others factories used cotton to sew. The cotton came from the South. The white landowners who sold the cotton got it by exploiting Black sharecropping farmers. The Northern economy could not operate without its reliance on a racist Southern economy. And here's another complication. There were 241 textile factories in New York City at this era. Of the 241, 234, almost every one of them, was owned by Central European Jews. So management, in the labor management disputes that we learned about growing up, management was Jewish. This was a Jew versus Jew situation. This is what becoming American meant in turn of the century New York City. we have erased the inter-Jewish part of the story. We've erased the sharecropping economy and racism part of the story in order to turn it into a story of Jews leading the labor union movement. And by the way, it's all true. Jews did lead the labor union movement, but that is only one piece of a much bigger story. Let's go to the New Deal of the 1930s and Franklin D. Roosevelt. Ironically, the Great Depression was a great time for Jews, at least when it came to the federal government, because FDR brought more Jews into government than any other president before him. I'm most interested, and actually chapter 1 of that first book, The Rabbi Showed You, talks about how Franklin D. Roosevelt embraced Jewish ideas about poverty in the New Deal. In fact, Isaac Rubinow, a Jewish immigrant from Russia, authored a good piece of the Social Security Act of 1935. In 1930, even before the worst of the Great Depression had hit, he went to the National Conference of Jewish Social Workers. And for those of you from the New York area and New Jersey counts, you may know Peter Stuyvesant, or at least heard of Stuyvesant. He was the anti-Semitic Dutch governor of New Amsterdam in 1654. It later became New York. And he made a deal with the Jews back in the 17th century. You can stay in America, but only if you take care of your own and don't go on welfare. Well, by the economic depression, a whole lot of people needed the support of the federal government, and this is what the New Deal was about. So here, Isaac Rubinow is asking his Jewish social worker colleagues, what do we owe this pledge to Governor Stuyvesant? He said, Jewish poverty is not a result of intergroup conditions. It's part and parcel of the entire economic and social problem of wealth production and wealth accumulation of the country as a whole. The expectation that the problem of Jewish poverty can be met individually, well, you may hope to eliminate it irrespective of the general economic forces, but that's an expression of excessive group pride, which is uncontrolled by scientific research and thinking. You see, according to Rubinow, becoming American meant American Jews in the 1930s needed to be treated just like everybody else. And indeed, here is evidence of it. This is a chart of expenditures by Jewish agencies in the 1930s for social welfare. And you'll notice here, 1929 is the baseline at just under $2 million. By 1932 and 33, it's up to $4 million. The federal government is feeding money into Jewish agencies to help Jewish people who need to eat. And then we'll see starting in 34, 35, the numbers are going down. But they're going down because now the New Deal is creating its own agencies, and Jews are going there because, as Rubinow said, if you need a job, if you need food, the fact that you happen to be Jewish should not be relevant, except if you were Black. Because it turns out the money that the New Deal gave to help people eat was not given equitably on racial grounds. Because Franklin D. Roosevelt needed the white Southern politicians to support him. And the way he got the support was to hand them basically blank checks from Washington with the New Deal money and told them that they got to decide how to spend it. If you tell a local politician, here's money and there's strings attached, they're not gonna like you. If you give a local politician money with no strings attached, they're gonna love you. So the good news for FDR, he built the Democratic Party and his presidency into a powerhouse. The cost of it was giving up control of where the money went. And we know Eleanor Roosevelt was much stronger on civil rights than Franklin. So what we learned was that these white Southern politicians gave most all of the money to white Southerners and very little of the New Deal money to Blacks. So here would be an example where systemic racism, where the notion of white supremacy is rewarding those who are identified as white. In this case, the Jewish social service agencies are getting the money, and those who are Black are not. So now we'll move to post-World War II America, which was a great time for American Jews. And this is the parts of the story that I hope most of us are familiar with. Anti-Semitism plummeted between 1945 and 1960. Now, we certainly still had it in the 50s, but it was not like it was in the 20s and 30s. And anti-Semitism was not holding back Jews as a group. It was more of an individual challenge. The anti-Semitic housing covenants that had kept Jews out of the suburbs had gone away. Those vacations where they said, no Jews and dogs allowed, through the 1950s, all of these eased. The GI Bill gave 500,000 Jewish families new opportunities with home loans, with small business loans, with college education funds. This was the time that American Jews sort of officially became American. Yay us. And one of the great examples, and you're in Bucks County, so this is great, would be Levittown. There's multiple Levittowns. The first one, of course, was in Pennsylvania. And here we have an oral history from one of the early Jewish residents of Levittown, PA. And here's what he writes. It was the talk of the Jewish community in Philadelphia, because who would think of buying a house with $1,000 down or $500 down? Levittown became a heavily Jewish-seeking area because immediately Levitt gave a beautiful piece of property to the conservative synagogue. Eventually, they gave ground to the Reform congregation too. I never experienced any discrimination in Levittown because I'm a proud Jew. But as a matter of fact, my mission is to educate not only the Jews, but the Christians. Most of my friends who are Christian, I teach them Bible. So I don't hide the fact that I'm Jewish. All right. He says no discrimination? Wait a minute. Levittown was racially exclusive. No blacks were allowed. Of course there was discrimination in Levittown. Of course, what he meant was there was no anti-Semitic discrimination. And that was true. But here's a moment when Jews achieving the American dream, getting home ownership in the suburbs, after working hard, going to college, all the rest of it, are now complicit in a racist system of housing segregation. Jews are now jumping over blacks in an exodus from the cities to the suburbs. And I should say, in stuff that in comments we'll get to Friday night when we talk about the book, this was very present in the Black Jewish Alliance of the Civil Rights Movement. Because even as Jews were leaders among whites in helping blacks, Jews were also leaving in mass urban areas when blacks moved into areas where blacks were not permitted, or at least not permitted in any kind of numbers. So here we have a new truth. Supporting home ownership meant supporting racism. It's hard to have a favorite slide on such a challenging topic, but this is my favorite slide, right? And since we're all URJ Jews, I'll give my critique in that particular spirit. How do American Jews, or how did American Jews visualize what it meant to become American? Well, here is, some of you may remember film strips from school. I am actually old enough that I did have film strips in elementary school. And this was a film strip created in 1954 by UAHC, which is now URJ, the Reform Movement, to celebrate 300 years of American Jewish history. And look at the line of Americans, right? It starts with the Pilgrims. I think, this looks like David Crockett. That's maybe Thomas Jefferson, founding fathers, David Crockett. Maybe that's like, I think that's like Abraham Lincoln, right? And you keep going back, and here the Jews are joining this particular group of people. Well, if this is how Jews in 1954 understood themselves, they are definitely white. They're definitely fully integrated Americans. They are now like the Pilgrims, even though we know they didn't come with the Pilgrims, they feel like they came with the Pilgrims. If you are Black, or a Black Jew, or Latinx, or Indigenous, right, or any person of color, you can't have this slide. This slide's existence demands Jewish whiteness, Jewish privilege, and communicates a notion of supremacy, right? That these are the elites, and American Jews have now joined that elite status. And of course, this was not the intention of the UAHC when they made this slide. And in fact, I think that's actually what makes it even more powerful. So now I'm gonna do a little bit of a quiz. Here's a quote, but I've taken away the author of the quote and the year. So I'll read it out to you, and then we'll do some thinking about who we think said it. All right, so a segregated system is not, oh, actually, let me give you the preview. The United States federal government was debating in the US Senate a bill for the federal government to give money to public schools. And this is testimony to the Education Subcommittee of the US Senate. A segregated system is not merely an unfair system, but it is a wasteful and inefficient system. Nevertheless, we do not believe that a federal law to equalize educational opportunities by public subsidy should be used as a means to attack the segregated school system. So long as the law guarantees that states having segregated school systems do not discriminate financially against children in minority schools, we believe the bill should be supported. So now I'm going to speak to all of you in the audience who went to law school. And if you're watching with somebody who didn't go to law school, you can really impress them right now because, well, most of us are familiar with the Brown versus Board of Education case of 1954, right? The trivia question for the legal scholars joining us tonight, what was the name of the Supreme Court case that the Brown decision overturned? And if you know it, put it in the chat, even though I don't have the chat up, but at least you get some credit for it. If you're watching with someone, let them know. And I'll let you know it was the 1896 case of Plessy versus Ferguson. Now, Plessy versus Ferguson, and actually now I can open up my chat. Okay, Dred Scott, that's a great guess, but Dred Scott was a little earlier, but Dred Scott actually was as important through this. The 1896 Plessy case was about interstate transportation, not about education, but the court ruled if you give as much money to the black sleeping car as you give to the white sleeping car on the railroad, all good. And what Brown said is, well, first of all, they never gave the same amount of money, to both sides on the racial line. But Brown said, even if they did, it's inherently unequal. So what we say, so it says here, segregated is not only unfair, but wasteful and inefficient. Nevertheless, and here it goes, we do not believe a federal law to equalize educational opportunities by public subsidy should be used as a means to attack segregated schools. So long as the law guarantees that states having segregated school systems do not discriminate financially, we believe the bill should be supported. This is the Plessy case, right? Yes, and Andy sending me a private message, yes. This is arguing in favor of Plessy. And who, of course, is going to argue in favor of Plessy in the US Senate? A white, Southern, racist, male senator, right? All right, let's take a look at him. Oh my goodness, Rabbi Stephen S. Wise, 1947. Could that be a mistake? Well, hold on. No, it's not a mistake. It really is Rabbi Stephen S. Wise. I was shocked, right, in the archives to discover this. By the way, Rabbi Wise, the leading rabbi of his generation, Free Synagogue in New York, personal friends with Franklin D. Roosevelt, one of the leader of the American Zionist movement, one of the early folks, one of the first American Jews to find out about the Shoah, the Holocaust, and work to mobilize American Jews. So let's go back and see how this happened. Okay, as it turns out, Rabbi Wise went to DC to testify for money for public schools, which is a very Jewish and rabbinic thing to do. And after he gave his testimony, the white Southern racist bigoted senators walked up to him and said, Rabbi, he said, we know what happens when the federal government sends its money into our schools. You're going to try to undo Jim Crow segregation. And we're going to have nothing to do with that. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to put an amendment to the bill. And the amendment's going to say, we get the money and you can't touch Jim Crow. Rabbi, we need you to support the amendment because guess what, Rabbi? If this amendment isn't passed, this bill never leaves committee. What an impossible position for Rabbi Wise to be in. On the one hand, if he holds his conscience, no kid in America is going to get any money. But if he wants at least kids who aren't Black in the South to have something, he's going to have to sacrifice on racial lines. And what you see in front of you is his moral compromise. And he gives the opening line: a segregated system is not merely unfair, but it's wasteful and inefficient. He wants everyone to know he does not like Jim Crow, right? And here's where he made his call. Nevertheless, comma, and then he explains. This is called liberal gradualism, which means you can't always get what you want the first time around, and better to get some money to some kids, and we're going to work on getting all the money to all the kids at the next step, right? And I think even like the Democratic Party had that debate around Biden and Bernie, right? Are we going to push hard, or are we going to just take it smaller step by step? All of you, I'm sure, have your own considered opinions on which of those two is better. But here's what I want to dramatize. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was 18 years old when this happened in 1947. So I think he was probably smart enough even at 18. Let's put him in that Senate chamber. If he was given the deal that Rabbi Wise was given, would he have taken the deal? No way. If you're Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., you're interested in racial equality. Not only does the amendment not give racial equality, it affirms Jim Crow, because the amendment says we are not going to change Jim Crow. So this is white liberal privilege. Stephen S. Wise had the ability to sell out Southern Blacks, right? That would be the most critical take on what he did. And I'll say that this conflict between what it is to be white and Jewish and what it is to fight for racial equality, and how you deal with the complexities of moving quickly or moving slowly and how you're going to do it, this was all over the place. And it's not just Rabbi Wise. I'm just using him as our example. And I think that these kinds of tensions went through the whole post-war period, and honestly, even as we're looking at what's going on today, also true. So in 1963, conservative movement Rabbi Richard Winograd was at the conservative movement's rabbinic assembly meeting, and they were passing their yearly resolutions on civil rights. And a bunch of the rabbis, who were all men in those days, said, look, if we're really committed to civil rights, let's not pass another resolution and go home. In fact, they said, Dr. King is scheduling a march like tomorrow. Let's end our conference early. Let's get on planes. Let's go to Birmingham and let's march with King. Well, the rabbinic assembly didn't cancel their, they didn't end early, but about a dozen of the rabbis did leave early, and they went on planes. And when Rabbi Winograd got to the airport, he was met by Birmingham Jews with signs that said, Yankee, go home. And Rabbi Winograd approached these Southern Jews, and here's a moment where I'm thinking, gosh, you're a rabbi, you're from the North, you're looking at bigoted Southern Jews who aren't supporting civil rights, you're gonna march with King. Give them a piece of your mind. Tell them why Jews need to fight for civil rights. And you can see here what he said instead. He said, I was not fully convinced we had the right to place the Jewish community of Birmingham in a more dangerous position than we're willing and able to place ourselves. In weighing the morality of this particular aspect, the scales were very even. I want to let you know, this was from my first book, this sentence changed my academic life, because I fully expected a Northern rabbi to let those Southern Jews know their obligation for civil rights, and for this rabbi of all rabbis to say that the moral scales were even, that it wasn't his place to be critical of Southern racist Jews. And what I came up with ultimately in my career is understanding where Winograd's head must have been. And I actually tried to find him. Sadly, he died before his time in 1974 of a heart attack. But I believe he understood becoming American. And he knew Southern Jews became American in Dixie. And he became American in Chicago. And he, as a rabbi, had to respect Kol Yisrael, that all of Israel is responsible one for another. And with that, he had great empathy for Southern Jews. So at once, it's a nice sign of sort of Jewish unity. And at the other hand, it's showing us the fact that complicity in support of racism is very complicated, and it's woven right into our American status. So this document is not in the book, but I want to read to you a section of it. This is Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail. You're probably familiar with the letter, but I want to read to you a particular part of it. I must make two honest confessions to you, my Christian and Jewish brothers. First, I must confess that over the past few years, I've been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride towards freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klaner, but it's the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action, who paternalistically believes he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by a mythical concept of time, and who constantly advises the Negro to wait for a more convenient season. Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. Lukewarm acceptance is much more bewildering than outright rejection. When I was suddenly catapulted into the leadership of the bus protest in Montgomery, Alabama a few years ago, I felt we would be supported by the white church. I felt that the white ministers, the priests, the rabbis of the South would be among our strongest allies. Instead, some have been outright opponents, refusing to understand the freedom movement and misrepresenting its leaders. All too many others have been more cautious than courageous and have remained silent behind the anesthetizing security of stained glass windows. Unquote. This is the challenge, right, that we face today. How much have we as Jewish social justice advocates followed this pattern that King described? And I think King was giving us a clue to the definition of racism as being not an anti-racist. It's difficult to hear, but Martin Luther King Jr. is arguing that good-hearted liberalism can often mean complicity in racism. Contemporary America. In the 60 years since the civil rights movement ended, we've seen how systemic racism operates in our own lives and without us having to do a thing. In the North, we have whites-only neighborhoods, even though we never had a history of Jim Crow laws. We have segregated schools since school enrollments follow the racial composition of our neighborhoods. Even as none of these Northern segregated schools are considered a challenge to the Brown decision, which we usually only apply to the South. When public school districts did integrate, sometimes with mandated busing programs, Jewish parents pulled their children from the schools. And with the ability to pay, they sent their kids to local private schools. Other times, they created Jewish day schools, where some parents wanted as much Jewish as they could get, while other parents wanted as little Jewish as necessary to keep them out of busing and public schools. The clash between white Jewish liberals and a new generation of Black civil rights activists ended the interracial alliance in the mid-1960s. American Jews backed the rights of Soviet Jews instead of Southern Blacks. Especially after the Six-Day War and after anti-Israel, anti-Zionist, and at times anti-Semitic rhetoric came from Black power, Jews turned away from American social justice and towards their own Jewish nationalism. Today, so many of these historical perspectives are centering on the Black Lives Matter movement. And on the most basic level, it's pretty simple. Black lives do, in fact, matter. White Jews should embrace Black Lives Matter as the next step in our historic commitment to civil rights. Yet, there's a great deal of concern by many white Jews. They hear anti-Israel and anti-Zionist statements at leftist rallies and those supporting the Palestinian cause. Sometimes these critiques move right into anti-Semitism. Most remember a 200-word statement placed in the nearly 40,000-word platform from the Movement for Black Lives organization. So this is a moment for pause and reflection. This is a moment that asks us to consider the new insights we've learned today and then apply them to current events. We err when we apply our racial understandings from the 50s and the 60s to 2021. This is where our new understanding of racism as systemic, of white supremacy as existing without us trying, of anti-racism as the new goal, this is when all of it comes into play. In the most simplistic terms, what's the point? It's about Black lives and the ways systemic racism denies Black Americans equity across the social and economic landscape. For this generation, then, Jews can show, once again, disproportionate support for Black lives. Only this time, white Jews will enter with an even more sophisticated understanding of how that racism operates. The kumbaya moments of the 50s and 60s were really important and they were productive. But still, what's happening today is even more important and it's even more difficult. We aren't just ending Jim Crow laws, right, and passing voting rights acts. We're getting at the heart and soul of American racism. We're fighting its informality and its deep entrenchment in America. And to do that, we must be able to see the ways in which we, as white Jews, are benefiting from white supremacy, even as we as Jews know all too well the pain and the threat of anti-Semitism and of the white supremacists themselves. Both of these can occur at the same time. This is perhaps the most important part of tonight's talk. By opening our eyes to otherwise uncomfortable and unknown parts of American Jewish history, we can see a clearer path to social justice. We can move beyond the static definition of racism that I hope none of us embrace anymore. And when we look at racism as systemic, we can think about all we need to do to make things better. White Jewish social justice activists who I've talked to about this tell me it's a whole lot better to sit side by side with Blacks in Black Lives Matter. Then you create the relationships necessary so that when Israel and Zionism and anti-Semitism comes up, you can actually have a good, heartfelt, meaningful conversation. And then I think we need to turn and focus in our own community with Jews of color. As so many of our Jewish organizations are already aware and hard at work, it turns out that systemic racism, the supremacy of white people, is playing out in our own Jewish communal life. Only now in these past few months are we learning to see things from a new perspective. And only now are we realizing that Jews of color have had this insight for years and years, right, for their whole lives. At best, we can tell 12 to 15% of American Jews identify as Jews of color, yet very few enter organized Jewish spaces. And here's a few reasons why. First, the Jewish test. We ask Jews of color to tell us how they could be Jewish when they show up, in synagogue, but we don't ask white Jews that question. For us, it could be simple curiosity, right? But for Jews of color, it could be a race-based test. It also exoticized Jews of color, right? We only ask to hear their story because we find them so exotic, and that objectifies. Two, the token. We give special attention to Jews of color because we want people to know how warm and inclusive we are. We put a single Jew of color on our publicity for our synagogue or for our JCC. We invite a Jew of color on a committee or on the board to show how inclusive we are. While seemingly well-intentioned, these acts call out Jews of color for being different, not for being white. Third, the help. Can I have a second helping of Shabbat dinner? Here's my trash. Oh no. The stories of Jews of color who are mistaken for synagogue and JCC custodians and are asked to perform those tasks are too many and too painful to count. The name tag. This happened at the last URJ biennial. A Jew of color came to get their name tag. The name was Jewish sounding. It included a banner that said keynote speaker to honor this individual. She couldn't get her own name tag. She was told that the actual person with that name had to pick it up. She said, I am the actual person. And when this broke on social media, of course, many more stories were told. And I want to say that Rabbi Rick Jacobs, the head of our movement, was on it right away and actually took, I think, really good system-wide action within the reform movement to see this as sort of the tip of the iceberg. The Guard. Especially after recent violence in synagogues, we have increased security, even armed guards. Yet we know that people of color face increased risk around police, and perhaps even more so private security officers who may not be as well trained. On the most obvious level, how can our Jewish spaces be more welcoming if Jews of color have to navigate their fear of police violence every time they come to pray? On a more subtle level, what assumptions do we have as white Jews to institute security protocols without even thinking about the impact that they have? In American Jewish life, how much are we losing because our lived Jewish communities don't include the 12 to 15% of Jews of color who are expressing their Judaism elsewhere? You see, it's not just Jews of color who suffer from this, it's all of us, because we lose if we can't live in the diverse Jewish community that already exists today. And for us to end on a hopeful note, this moment actually gives us an opportunity for a new approach to racial justice. By seeing what has been invisible to us in American Jewish history, we can begin to see what's been vivid for Black Americans and other communities of color. By letting go of our closely guarded version of American Jewish history, we can begin to see another side of our social mobility, the unintended negative consequences of our success. That knowledge, that consciousness is where we need to be to start the process of dismantling a system that gives social and economic supremacy to white Jews over communities of color. In the best possible way, we can prove Dr. King's upset about Jewish moderates in his letter to a Birmingham jail. We can prove him wrong while we prove his vision of a diverse America right. So I want to thank you for listening. Thank you for your openness, and hand it to the rabbi however you would like to proceed.
So thank you, Dr. Dollinger. And seeing that there are no questions, I think we'll just wrap it up. No, just kidding. Again, this is the second time that I've heard this talk, and it's certainly expanded, reflecting more of more of the realities in which we find ourselves, and definitely a lot to chew on and whatnot. It's going to be a little bit difficult to kind of call up us. I think what I want to ask, and Mark, let me know if this will work for you. If I have people just type some questions in the chat box, sure. You might be able to kind of see what's there and sort of group some things together, and probably keep some things a little bit more succinct if we want to, have a little bit of a dialogue for a few minutes. Is that? I think is that the best. I'm actually a little bit newer. You have much more experience on the Zoom lectures than I do. So is that I think that might be the better way to do it?
Yeah. So, right. So if people want to, type their questions in there, I can take it from that. And then if people want to unmute, if we want to do a dialogue, we can try that. I have a nice feature. I can see all of you on the same screen, so it's better for me. Right. A lot of you have only 25 people on the screen, so you have to keep flipping back and forth. But I'll just start in order. Did I discuss the Rosenwald Foundation Sears school building program in the South? I actually didn't, and that's mostly because it's important and well documented, and part of writing a new book in history is to write new stuff, but that's true. Did I know Temple Shalom mentioned in the Levittown, PA, merged into our congregation in this century? No, I didn't, but that is a great piece of synagogue history trivia.
Mark, if I can just interrupt for one quick second, because I was actually reading the excerpt, because I have the book here, and it was just so that folks know that particular reflection was actually provided by Cantor David Wisnia, who many of us know, longtime cantor in our community. And it was actually kind of reading through, there was a little piece there that says when Temple Shalom, he reflects on Temple Shalom being sold and merging with Shir Me. So Shir Me is in your book and in that document. So
Oh, thank you. Okay, I didn't even realize that. That's
yeah,
good to know.
okay. So you wouldn't be looking for it, but we are. So
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. I'm going to be in Baltimore tomorrow, and they found a Baltimore quote in one of my books and said, talk about the Baltimore quote. I said, let me find it. We'll be good. So that's great. A direct message. Rosenwald supported Jim Crow by building schools for Blacks only, yet he wanted to increase Black literacy. So thank you. Yeah, I think there's actually a new study coming out on Rosenwald, and he did lots of good stuff, and he was also a part of his time in terms of racism. Yeah, so that is a complicated story, which I think most of them were. What do I think of the reparations movement? Okay, so very quickly, I moved from being an academic historian to a current day commentator. So I have kind of a professional ethic, which is that my job is to share with you the research I had in the archives and my interpretations of history. Understanding that everyone sort of wants to know, how it applies. So I'll just say, I'll give you my own personal thoughts, but when I do that, these are just, a bunch of interested folks talking about things. I support reparations movement because I believe that the systemic issues that began in slavery and with the end of Reconstruction in 1877 developed systems which perpetuate from generation to generation. American Jews ended up on the correct side, in terms of social mobility. So that's great for us. And I would say that reparations is very sophisticated. And a whole lot of sort of white liberal Jews react negatively to reparations because they think like you're going to start writing checks to people. It's actually about changing the systems of power in ways that we can sort of break out of the systemic nature of it and find things that are going to work for everyone. Have you found any responses to the rabbi from Gratz? As a Philly girl, I want to hold on to my respect for the Gratz family. No, I haven't, but part of it is, and thank you, this is, and for Ron, I want to give a larger point here. Even as I'm criticizing the racism involved in all of these, I also don't mean to pass moral judgment, as weird as that sounds, because my thesis is to become American is to benefit from this. It probably means to be complicit, even if you're not actually what we would call, like a KKK racist. And because of its ubiquity, it is what makes it so hard to fight. So really, I want to say that all of us are swimming in a sea of racism regardless. So that's meant not to excuse it or apologize for it. It is just to see it in a new light, and hopefully one that will make it easier or better to address. What shocked you the most about Jewish American history in my studies? This is it. This is my career, right? I was raised in the 1970s in the white suburbs of LA and went to Temple Beth Ellen Center. And I had sort of this vision. And then I went to the archives. And now I'm studying a lot on race, and I'm realizing the profound difference between historical memory, what I was taught growing up, and what's going on. And the good news from the bad news of the racial reckoning is it's out in the open, right? I think all of us in this country, and the fact that there's such strong support for this program, and I want to appreciate the endowed, memorial that you have to bring me here, that folks are interested in this. And I don't think we as an American Jewish group could have done this without, all of the trauma that we've seen. My friend's parents, the Weinsteins, are part of a group in Levittown, PA, who fought to allow Black folks to move in. They were there to welcome the first Black family in the community. Fantastic. How do you explain the alliance between rabbis and Martin Luther King, how important the movement was, and then it fell apart? Lenore, what a great question. That's what I'm going to talk about Friday night. So I'm just going to hold it off because that's literally what that talk is. I was so upset about colonial Jews and slave trade in my research. Thank you, Andy. Believe that people who grew up in Philadelphia, even the women's suffrage movement, needed to compromise Black votes. Yeah, and even the abolitionist movement of the 19th century was racist. A lot of the abolitionists were doing it out of Christian ideas, not out of racial equality ideas. So yeah, I'll just tell you in general as a metaphor, when I finished my dissertation and I was turning it into a book, I went to my doctoral advisor and I said, criticize everything you can about the manuscript. I'd rather hear it from you in the privacy of your office than read about it in the journal reviews. I said, when I'm done with this manuscript, I want to be on rock solid academic ground. And Bruce Schulman, now at Boston University, he burst out laughing and he said, Mark, it's all quicksand, right? So that's like a metaphor for all of this, right? We all have these rock solid ideas of our history and racial justice and racism. And what we've got, you know, in this reckoning is the understanding that we're all on quicksand, and it's anxiety producing and debilitating in some ways, but ultimately, I think this is where we need to be. Philadelphia is a segregated city, black, white, also religions had their own neighborhoods. Why do I think anti-Semitism decreased from 1945 to 1960? Great question. A lot of this had to do with the Cold War. It's also the reason for the civil rights movement growing in the 1950s. When the Soviet Union became the new enemy of the United States prided itself on democracy, and it went against communism. To have anti-Semitism and racism in a democracy really undermines your claim to be better than communism. So much of the movement to show that America did not discriminate against its own people was a way to show the commies that we were better. How has the Black community regarded your books? So I'll say, of course, you know, there's a lot of differentiated opinion among Blacks on the book. I can share with you, and I'll talk a little bit more about this generally on Friday. My book is about Black power, but it's really about white Jews. I'm just using the Black power movement to reflect on the experience of white Jews. So when scholars in African American history, when we engage one another, when we're on panels, when we debate, they're actually not interested in what I'm writing on, right? Because they're interested in the experience of Blacks in America, and I'm interested in the experience of white Jews. All that said, the feedback I've received is an appreciation that I'm moving Black power to the center of the historical debate. Part of the challenge is that white Jews often center white Jews in their racial justice work by talking about, you know, how many white Jews supported the civil rights movement with King and Heschel and the rest of it. And a repeated frustration is for Black folk who are trying to move their movement for racial equality and are certainly looking for white allies who are discomforted by the fact that many Jews are trying to move themselves into the center of the conversation. What do I think of Feinstein books from Temple University? Murray Feinstein, okay, thank you. Murray of blessed memory was one of the leading scholars of the Black-Jewish relationship. Some of you may know him. He worked and led the AJC for a long time. He was a colleague, you know, for many years. And in fact, when I spent my year at Bryn Mawr, I got to have a bunch of lunches with him, which are really nice. So I'm a big fan of the Institute at Temple. Lila Corin Berman, my colleague, is running it now. She just has an important new book out on Jewish philanthropy, if you're interested. So you're living, and you probably all know that the greater Philadelphia area has more college students than the greater Boston area. It's one of my great Philadelphia trivia things that I say to all my Boston friends. So, except the ones who support baseball, Rabbi, I know. Okay, all right, so Rabbi asked about shared legacies. Have folks seen the movie?
Yeah, so,
Okay.
so just a little preface, many of us here, as part of this three-part series we began last week, and it was very deliberate, Mark, in terms of how I introduced it, as sort of beginning this three-part series with sort of like the heyday, the kumbaya, sort of like this feel-good moment of this movie. I know that we had a little bit of conversation back and forth, and I just would love to hear some of your perspective, especially how it relates to your work right now, and maybe a little preview of what we're going to hear on Friday as well.
Okay, great question, and I'll name drop now because This morning, I got a phone call from Professor Susanna Heschel, who is at Dartmouth in Jewish Studies. She's the daughter of Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. If you're interested, she and I will be on a larger panel that the Forward is running tomorrow, 4 p.m. your time. If you go to forward.com, you can find the link. And she asked me, what'd you think of the movie? Because if you haven't, she's in the movie, right? A lot. And here's here's my view. I'll give you 3 different things. First, it's beautifully made as a movie, just in terms of the quality. Second, it tells an extraordinary story of personal sacrifice by white Jews and blacks for the sake of racial justice. And I told Professor Heschel this morning, there's an extraordinary scene where she is sitting at a table with a child of I think it's one of King's kids, actually. And they're both talking about their dads and what it was like for them growing up, in those households. And I was quite moved by it. And its thesis is the story of Jewish success, right? It centers white Jews in the civil rights movement, and it doesn't tell the story of the complexities of that relationship or any of the backgrounds that I shared with you today. And in fact, then to lead into Friday, what's going to happen on Friday is we're going to open with really the shared legacies view of how great it was that so many white Jews were so supportive of the civil rights movement, yay us, to the fact that in the mid-1960s, the alliance broke with the rise of Black power and Black anti-Semitism, and everything went to hell in a handbasket, and can't we return to the good old days, right? And I think that was really the theme of the movie. And what I'm going to do on Friday is my best to turn that upside down, around in every possible way, to put you back on quicksand with everything you thought about that, and try to reformulate it in a new, and I hope even more optimistic way.
So Mark, I think that's a great way to end and sort of leave sort of little to be continued for Friday night. And obviously because Friday night's lecture is really during the service. It's not going to be an hour-long lecture, including the service. But just so folks know, we're going to have a fairly shortened liturgy so that we can give Dr. Dollinger enough time. We're kind of figuring out some of the order of a few things, but we'll definitely have time to hear. And then also for a little bit of conversation afterwards as well. So I just want to, again, thank you, Dr. Mark Dollinger, for joining us and for being here. I will say, like this, when I was coming here, I have this a whole lot of favorite folks from California who I've said, God, if I could only bring them here, but like it's just a little bit more complicated than like flying down for the day as he used to do with us. The benefit of pandemic is these technologies enable us to bring someone of his scholarship and renown to come to us without him from the comfort of his own home as well. So we are very grateful to have you here. Very grateful for the Islamovitz Hudis Fund for helping to support Dr. Dollinger's his presentation tonight. I just will also say, just in terms of his work and his commitment to his students at San Francisco State University, with your permission, Mark, is that the honorary that is normally for this is all going to a scholarship fund to help support some of the more vulnerable students at SF State right now. So just really appreciate that commitment of tzedakah to help those who are certainly part of your academic family as well. So service is at 6:30 on Friday night, and Mark will be beginning right around 7 o'clock or so. So we look forward to seeing folks and continuing the conversation. So thank you.
Take care. Stay healthy, everyone. See you Friday.